The following is a talk I gave on Mozart Symphony No. 41, Kerschel 551, nicknamed Jupiter, on the occasion of its performance by the Stockton Symphony in March 2019. The lecture notes that accompany the talk can be found on my website, morissenegor.com, along with many other Symphony Insights podcasts and their notes. If you take the time to listen to the entire podcast, I strongly recommend that you follow with a recording of the symphony so that you can put all my snippets together into a whole. And now, onward with Mozart. We will start with a quote from musicologist Neil Zaslaw. Quote, "It is perhaps insufficiently recognized how revolutionary the Jupiter Symphony is in its ideas and their working out." Unquote. As we examine this symphony in detail, the veracity of the statement will emerge. The Jupiter, composed in 1788, is Mozart's final symphony. His untimely death at age 34 prevented the world from any more masterpieces from this remarkable genius. We will first examine Mozart's biography and the historical context of the symphony before we examine details of the music. Biography of Mozart, 1756 to 1791. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was born in Salzburg, Austria. His father, Leopold Mozart, was an accomplished musician, a violinist, and a composer. Mozart's middle name is actually Gottlieb. It means chosen by God. Later in life, partly in jest, he adopted the name Amadei, the Latin version of Gottlieb. After his untimely death, his followers elevated the word to the more hagiographic Amadeus. Mozart was an extraordinary child prodigy. He started keyboard at age 3 and began composing minuets at age 5. Mozart's father, Leopold, turned him into a child star, taking him all over Europe to concertize at age 7 through 10. The little boy played to kings and royalty and astounded everyone. As with many child stars, Mozart grew into a maladapted man, irreverent and vulgar, and rebellious, both against the establishment and particularly his stage father, who sought to control his son's career beyond childhood. Mozart's early start got his career started at a young age. He became concertmaster to the Archbishop of Salzburg in 1772 at age 15. 10 years later, at age 25, Mozart resigned the Salzburg post and moved to Vienna. There he became a freelance musician and composer. It was a bad move at a time when musicians vied for top spots in Europe's highest courts. The move also strained his relationship with his controlling father. His relationship with Leopold was further strained when a year later he married Constanze Weber, a commoner from a Mannheim musical family. The late 1780s was a financially difficult time for Mozart. Nevertheless, his operas Idomeneo, 1781, and The Abduction from the Seraglio, 1782, were big hits and made him famous as a composer. Mozart was 30 when his opera Marriage of Figaro premiered in 1786. It caused a stir among the aristocracy with its mockery of them. This was followed by Don Giovanni, composed around the time of his father's death in 1787. In the later 1780s, Mozart's financial situation deteriorated. This was also a difficult time for Mozart's country, Austria. A war with the Ottoman Turks had weakened the state and depleted the treasury. This in turn caused serious financial difficulties for Mozart's patrons that included aristocrats, especially the emperor himself, Franz Joseph II. Mozart's patronage was thus diminished. In 1788, Mozart survived by borrowing money from a Michael von Puschberg, wealthy textile merchant and a friend. Despite these difficulties, that year Mozart maintained a strong compositional output. His symphonies number 39, 40, and 41, nowadays regarded as grand masterpieces, were all written in a burst of creativity in the summer of 1788. By 1790, however, depressed and sick, Mozart's compositional output would reach a nadir. 1791, the year of his death, was marked with a reinvigorated output that included the opera The Magic Flute, his clarinet concerto, his final piano concerto, and his unfinished Requiem. For more information on the Requiem, you can listen to my podcast on this work at my website morissenegor.com or in SoundCloud. Mozart died December 5, 1791, at age 34. Mozart's symphonic output. Mozart's career occurred in what we now call the classical era in Western music history, 1750 to 1803. This was a time when the symphony became codified. Joseph Haydn and Wolfgang Mozart, the major composers of the time, along with many others, created a body of symphonies that became the classical era model for the genre. Symphony was to be elevated into a more exalted genre by Beethoven, who followed. It flourished into its golden age in the 1800s, the Romantic era. The more elaborate symphonies of this era all looked back at the classical model of Haydn and Mozart, using them as templates for their own frameworks. Mozart's 41 symphonies were not composed at a steady pace. As his career advanced, his symphonic output diminished. In 7 years, between 1764 and 1771, Mozart composed his first 35 symphonies. In 1772 through 1781, 9 years, he composed 28 symphonies. In the next 9 years, however, 1782 through 1791, he composed only 6. Mozart's Symphony No. 41, his last, was composed in 1788. From there to December 1791, in the last 3 years of his life, Mozart did not produce any new symphonies. Why is that? The reason for this peculiar decrease in output is unclear. Some scholars speculate that it had to do with the practical commercial realities of Mozart's professional life as a freelancer. He had to compose whatever sold best. Others wonder whether the symphony as a genre was evolving in length and complexity such that, as Neil Zaslaw puts it, they could not be tossed out with such ease. Note that during Mozart's time, symphonies did not have the same prestige as vocal music or music created for elite connoisseurs. Mozart's symphonies were not classics to be savored, repeated, and passed on to posterity, says Zaslaw, but rather music for use to be enjoyed and replaced by newer works. The output of other contemporary composers provides support for the latter argument. Many composers of the late 1700s, most now unknown, had an overall output of around 50-plus symphonies. Haydn, who, unlike Mozart, lived to age 77 and had a full career, produced 104. Yet in the 1800s, the Romantic era, we find much meager symphonic outputs. Beethoven, Dvorak, Bruckner, Mahler, and Schubert produced 9 each. Mendelssohn 6, Schumann and Brahms 4 each. Zaslow argues that during Mozart's time, the emerging middle class valued quality over quantity, driving symphonic output down. Instead of a new symphony for each evening's entertainment, patrons came to prefer a few superior symphonies, each heard several times. This, of course, is essentially the world we live in today. As you'll soon find out, Mozart's Jupiter Symphony represents a step in this evolutionary process, presenting a degree of complexity and inventiveness uncharacteristic of its time. History of Symphony No. 41. The death of Leopold, Mozart's father, in 1787, a year prior to the completion of the Jupiter Symphony, deprived historians of written records. Previously, Wolfgang's letters to his father had been a rich source of information. Thus, there is very little known about the genesis of this symphony. The Jupiter belongs to a body of symphonies nowadays grouped as Mozart's Viennese symphonies, all composed in Vienna. There are 6 of them. The Hafner, No. 35, 1782. The Linz, No. 36, 1783. The Prague, No. 38, 1787. And the final 3, numbers 39, 40, and 41, all composed in 1788. Elaine Sisman, who wrote a monograph about the Jupiter, says, nearly every one of Mozart's 6 Viennese symphonies had a hasty gestation. The final 3 were entered into Mozart's catalogue in the summer of 1788. Number 39 on June 25, number 40 on July 26, and number 41 on August 10. It is thought that these were intended for a concert that never took place. Whether Mozart ever heard these 3 performed is a matter of controversy. So is the idea that Mozart may have intended these to be a trilogy. The title. Nicknames ascribed to great musical works rarely deserve to be associated with them and would have been mostly rejected by their creators. Jupiter is no exception. Respected musicologist Sir Donald Tovey says, the title Jupiter takes rank with the titles Emperor Concerto and Moonlight Sonata as among the silliest injuries ever inflicted on great works of art. The title is derived from a convoluted sequence of quotes, mainly via Mozart's son Franz, who quoted violinist and impresario Johann Peter Solomon as having coined the nickname. In 1829, 38 years after Mozart died, Franz told a visitor, Vincent Novello, an English composer and publisher, that the finale to his father's symphony in C was the highest triumph of instrumental composition. He also mentioned that Solomon had christened it the Jupiter. Perhaps Jupiter implies, quote, noble, grand, classical, unquote, says music critic Michael Steinberg. It is not clear whether Mozart would have accepted this nickname for his final symphony. As Tovey puts it, Mozart's musical culture may have been Italian, but his artistic nature was neither Roman nor Greco-Roman. He was as Greek as Keats. Overview. Movement 1. Allegro vivace in C major, sonata form 4/4 time. Movement 2. Andante cantabile, F major sonata form 3/4 time. Movement 3. Menuetto allegretto, ternary form ABA, C major 3/4 time. Movement 4. Molto allegro, C major 4/4 time. Movement 1. The Allegro vivace. Exposition. The movement begins with an exposition in which Mozart presents a diversity of themes. We will examine each and then listen to the entire exposition. Theme 1 in C major. The first theme begins with an assertive gesture, a loud orchestral chord and 2 loud arpeggios, a martial coup d'archet. The term coup d'archet generally refers to a bow stroke in string playing. The special term le premier coup d'archet, the first coup d'archet, was used in the late 18th century to refer to a loud orchestral passage, often in unison, with which many symphonies began. It was thought to have been invented by the French court composer Jean-Baptiste Lully, 1632 through 1687. Mozart used it frequently. The coup d'archet receives a soft, lyrical response from the first violins. The gesture is then repeated, the violin response sequenced up. That means repeated in a higher register. Here is that coup d'archet and its response repeated twice. The remainder of Theme 1 is a loud, vigorous, martial-sounding orchestral passage. It comes to a close cadence and a pause. A close cadence is the musical equivalent of a period in written prose. Coup d'archet. String response. Coup d'archet. String response sequenced up. Theme 1. A few words about the opening coup d'archet before we move on. The opening coup d'archet and the response that follows has been described as formulaic for Mozart. 10 years earlier, Mozart wrote to his father that he had been careful not to neglect the same gesture in his Symphony No. 31 of 1778, also known as his Paris Symphony. Here is a comparison of the Paris opening versus the Jupiter. Paris Symphony, coup d'archet. And once again, the Jupiter. About this Paris Symphony opening, Mozart wrote to his father saying, "What a fuss the oxen here make of this trick! The devil take me if I can see any difference." Based on this, we can conclude that despite his disdain for his audience, Mozart was aiming to please them. Indeed, the diversity of styles we will encounter in the exposition is most likely aimed to please as many in his audience as possible. The exposition continues with a transitional theme in C major. It is a rising melody in woodwinds, which then falls comically. It receives a quiet response from violins. The woodwind gesture is repeated with another violin response, sequenced down. Strings extend the violin response in a quiet passage. A modulating bridge follows. It begins with an abrupt return of the coup d'archet, which then leads to a lengthy, loud passage based on Theme 1 material, ending in an open cadence. An open cadence is the musical equivalent of a comma in written prose. Here is the transitional theme and the modulating bridge. Transitional theme. Modulating bridge. Note that the events of the modulating bridge parallel those of the very beginning, the opening coup d'archet and theme 1. Some consider this section to be a varied restatement of the theme 1 complex. Theme 2. We now arrive at the second theme of the exposition. It is a pretty four-square melody in the first violins, accompanied by a seesawing ostinato in the second violins. An ostinato is a recurring musical figure, usually in the bass. The theme is in the key of G major, the dominant to C major. This key change is standard in classical era sonata form movements set in a major key. The second theme is extended in a quiet passage that features a conversation between the upper and lower strings. The passage quietly dies down to an open cadence and a pregnant pause. The C minor shock. At this point in classical era sonata form, the music moves on to the closing section. Before this, however, Mozart has a surprise for us that Elaine Sisman called the C minor shock. The pleasant mood is suddenly interrupted by a loud C minor passage in orchestra. The music proceeds vigorously, moving on to C major, with theme 1 material still in a dark mood. It comes to another open cadence and a pregnant pause. Here is the C minor shock. Notice how each of the themes presented so far are clearly delineated by the composer, either with easily recognizable cadences, that is, musical punctuations, and or pauses. This is a common feature of classical era music. Closing section. We finally arrive at the closing section. Here, Mozart recycles a tune that he has already used elsewhere. It is a popular style, aria-like theme in strings, easy to remember and whistle. This theme is a direct quote from a passage in a concert aria that Mozart wrote in 1788, Un bacio di mano, a hand kiss. A concert aria is a freestanding piece of vocal music intended for performance independent of any opera.
Voi siete un po' tondo, mio caro Pompeo, le stanze del mondo andate a studiar, andate a studiar, andate a studiar.
The closing section ends with another vigorous tutti passage, reminiscent of Eine kleine Nachtmusik. It concludes with a closed cadence. At this point, we are ready to hear the entire exposition. Coup d'archet, string response. Coup d'archet, string response. Theme 1. Transitional theme. Coup d'archet, modulating bridge. Theme 2. C minor shock. Closing theme, un bacio di mano. Vigorous end to the closing section. As you just heard, the exposition features a multiplicity of expressions that range from grand-style drama to song to comic opera, and with the C minor passage, a bit of Sturm und Drang. Exposition repeat. In keeping with classical era tradition, the exposition is repeated verbatim. Development. The development is brief. It is in 3 parts. It features the arioso closing theme, the opening coup d'archet, and the transitional theme. In development part 1, the aria is developed. After a brief wind transition, the closing theme is repeated in E flat by the violins with a pedal accompaniment in winds. A pedal is a continuously held note. The tail end of the tune is echoed in winds. This leads to an orchestral passage that develops this motive. Some transitional music at the end is quiet in winds and strings. Wind transition. Closing theme aria. Tail end of aria developed. Quiet transitional passage. In part 2, the transitional theme is developed. The passage begins with a quiet version of the opening coup d'archet and its string response overlaid with the comic falling idea of the transitional theme in bassoon. The reappearance of the coup d'archet may give the impression of recapitulation, but it is soon dispelled by what follows. The transitional theme is developed, sequenced up in woodwinds 3 times, with a coup d'archet in counterpoint. A loud passage then follows in which the 2-note rising antecedent of the transitional theme is developed. The passage also uses the inversion of this idea. Here's development part 2, transitional theme developed. Part 3 is brief and calm. It is based on the closing theme motive. The tail end of the aria from development part 1 returns in a brief wind passage with sustained horns. This provides a transition to recapitulation. Let's now hear the full development into a bit of the recap. I will narrate. Part 1. Part 2. Part 3. Recapitulation. Classical era developments were usually brief. In the Romantic era, developments get more and more elaborate. Even though the Jupiter Symphony was one of the most complex that Mozart wrote, this development is in keeping with the custom of its time. Recapitulation. In recapitulation, the material of the exposition, with a few exceptions, returns in C major, the home key of the movement. This resolves the tension set up by the move to G major in Theme 2 and the closing section. It is standard procedure for classical era sonata form movements. Theme 1 returns verbatim. The transitional theme returns in slight variation. The loud bridge that begins with a coup d'archet does not need to modulate, so it is slightly different than the exposition version. Theme 2 returns in the home key of C major. The C minor shock returns in variation, but still shocking in F minor. The vigorous passage that follows continues in D major. The closing theme derived from Un bacio di mano returns in the home key C major. The vigorous orchestral passage that follows is slightly varied from its earlier version, serving a concluding function. Here is the recapitulation. I will narrate. Coup d'archet. Coup d'archet. Theme 1. Transitional theme. Coup d'archet. Bridge. Theme 2. C minor shock in F minor. Closing theme, Un bacio di mano. Vigorous end of the closing section. And that was the end of the movement. There is no distinct coda, a separate section of concluding music. A coda was not obligatory in classical times. Some comments on Movement 1. By classical era standards, this is a fairly complex movement in the diversity of the themes presented. The usual norm is an assertive theme 1, a lyrical theme 2, and some sort of closing theme. Here, in addition to those, we have a memorable transitional theme and the C minor shock that returns in recap in F minor, both breaking the harmonic traditions of the classical sonata form. In this regard, the first movement of Mozart's Last Symphony looks ahead to the Romantic era, where such departure from the classical model became routine. In terms of musical style, Mozart presents a smorgasbord of material. As Elaine Sisman puts it, the exposition charts a course from the grand style, first theme, down the stylistic spectrum to the singing style, second theme, then further down still to a comic popular style, closing theme. This, as I indicated earlier, may have been an attempt at crowd-pleasing. After all, this symphony, along with its Viennese brethren, were written for commercial reasons. But as Steinberg pointed out, Mozart, even when commercially pandering, manages to be remarkably artful. Let me again mention how clear the lines of musical narrative are. The individual themes and various sections of the movement are unmistakably demarcated by cadences and pauses. This makes the movement easy to follow. Movement 2, Andante cantabile. This is another sonata form movement. Mozart presents a first theme in F major in two different variations, the first in treble, the second in bass. The first version of theme 1, the treble, unfolds over 10 measures and in 5 phrases: A prime, B, C, C prime. Phrases A and A prime are in muted violins. It begins with an antecedent, a soft, slow, rising-falling melody with dotted rhythms. It receives an incomplete reply from the orchestra, a single loud chord. Phrase A prime is a repetition of A sequenced up. Note, Elaine Sisman points out that A and A prime carry a saraband rhythm. A saraband is a Baroque-era triple-meter dance, slower than the minuet, with emphasis on the second beat. Phrase B is an extension of the A motive in upper strings with figurations. Phrases C and C prime are yet more elaborate extensions of A with woodwind figurations. Here's theme 1, first version. I will narrate the phrases. Phrase A. Phrase A prime. Phrase B. Phrase C. Phrase C prime. Theme 1, repeat in variation. In the bass version of theme 1, phrase A reappears, played by the basses, with a pulsating bassoon accompaniment. It is followed by the A double prime. The phrase is sequenced differently than the prior version. A new passage, phrase D, features leisurely lyrical figurations in upper strings. It ends in an open cadence. Phrase A. Phrase A double prime. Phrase D. Note that neither version of theme 1 is complete. The antecedent posed by phrase A consistently receives a truncated, incomplete answer. Bridge, C minor shock. At this point, we expect a modulating bridge towards a second theme in a different key. Instead, Mozart delivers a shock. Suddenly and unexpectedly, the music changes to the key of C minor. Elaine Sisman comments on this abrupt change. Quote, "The beautiful sound world of the principal theme is shattered in a suddenly forte transitional passage." Unquote. The passage unfolds over 9 measures and in 3 phrases: AM, AM prime, and AM double prime. Phrase AM is a variation of A. It begins in unaccompanied oboe and bassoon and receives a loud response, a single orchestral chord. Phrase AM prime sequences AM and now also features a heartbeat-like accompaniment in strings that adds to the pathos. The music sounds tragic. Phrase AM double prime is an extension in full orchestra, loud and with repeated orchestral chords hammering away at the tragic mood. Finally, the music returns to a more lyrical mood in a transitional string passage. Here's the bridge, the C minor shock. I will narrate the phrases. Phrase AM. Phrase AM prime. Phrase AM double prime. Transitional string passage. Note that this passage parallels the similar C minor shock of Movement 1. Mozart gives this anguished passage a good deal of importance. The upcoming development will be almost completely devoted to it. Most bridge sections in sonata form movements function as just that, a modulating bridge connecting the two main themes. They tend not to be of crucial expressive importance, remaining secondary to the main motives. The dramatic importance of this particular bridge is therefore striking. Theme 2 in C major. We now reach the second theme. This is a lyrical theme in the expected key of C major, the dominant of F major. It is in 4 phrases: A prime, B prime. Phrase A features a rising melody in oboe and bassoon, answered by a staccato triplet in flute and horn. Phrase A prime sequences the melody up. Phrase B is a violin melody that utilizes both motives. Phrase B prime features an extension of this melody with increasingly elaborate figurations. Here's theme 2. Phrase A. Phrase A prime. Phrase B. Phrase B prime. The music directly moves on to the closing section, a brief passage, 6 measures, featuring a closing theme and transition to development. The closing theme is a quiet, lyrical, 4-square melody featuring a full pair of antecedent consequents, a contrast to the incomplete consequence of theme 1, A prime, B prime. Phrase A is an antecedent in violins that begins with a 3-note rising idea and continues with a brief ornate figuration. Phrase B in flute and oboe is an inversion of the 3 notes, followed by figurations. Horns provide a pulsing accompaniment. Phrases A prime and B prime provide a satisfying conclusion to the tune. Unaccompanied violins, still muted, provide a lyrical transition full of triplets. Here's the closing section. Phrase A. Phrase B. Phrase A prime. Phrase B prime. String transition to development. Again, unlike theme 1, the closing theme does have a conclusion. Let's now hear the entire exposition. I will narrate the parts. Theme 1. Theme 1, bass version. Bridge C minor shock. Theme 2. Closing section. Development. The development is brief and almost exclusively devoted to the dramatic material from the C minor bridge. It is in 2 parts. In part 1, the bridge music returns. Phrase AM is anguished in D minor. Phrases AM prime and AM double prime follow a series of mournful orchestral chords going through different key areas. Part 2 consists of a quiet and peaceful transition into recapitulation. It echoes in different instrument groups, strings, horns, and winds, and it calms down the anguish. Here is the development. As you just heard, the main expressive element of the development is the pathos of the minor mode music introduced in the bridge. Recapitulation. As I indicated earlier, the classical era norm for recapitulation is a nearly verbatim return of the exposition, with everything in the home key. In this second movement, Mozart presents us with a recap that deviates from the norm in major ways. To begin with, the first theme does not return as in the exposition, but rather in a series of developmental variations. This might confuse the listener, giving the impression that maybe the development is still continuing. It is not. In the first developmental variation, theme 1 returns in treble in the home key of F major, but is altered. Phrase A is stated by violins only once. Its single, incomplete consequent is no longer a loud orchestral chord, but a soft staccato note in violins only. Phrases A' and B are absent. Instead, a variation of phrase C, scale figuration in basses and violins, provides a developmental tail to the theme. The second developmental variation in bass follows, with phrase A stated softly in the basses, followed by a brief phrase D, figurations in upper strings. An extended polyphonic developmental passage based on A and D motives is loud, going from forte to fortissimo. This passage features scale figurations that alternate between upper and lower strings in the bass. Above it, horns and winds assertively state variations on the main motive of A in a martial climax. The music then seamlessly transitions into the bridge. Here's recap the two developmental versions of theme 1. Treble version, phrase A. Developmental extension. Bass version. Developmental extension. Loud passage with scale figurations. This dramatically varied presentation of theme 1 is most unusual for its time. In essence, Mozart is presenting us with a development of theme 1 that should have occurred in the development section, not in recap. In this regard, the movement is forward-looking, significantly ahead of its time. We will get a similar treatment of theme 1 in the fourth movement. Such gestures are to be found in the Romantic era, decades after Mozart. The bridge is significantly truncated. It lacks the shock effect of the version in the exposition. After the extended treatment this music received in development, repeating this would have been redundant. The truncation is thus no surprise. Nevertheless, it is still a deviation from the classical era norm. Theme 2 and closing section. From this point on, the movement returns to what is expected of the classical model. Theme 2 returns verbatim in the home key of F major. The closing section follows, also in F major. The transition is truncated to only one measure. Here is the remainder of the recap: the bridge, Theme 2, and closing section. Bridge. Theme 2. Closing section. Unlike the first movement, the second features a coda in which the exposition version of Theme 1, the one missing from the recap, returns with phrases A, B, and C prime. The movement concludes quietly with repeated horn octaves and concluding figurations in violin and oboe. This final return of Theme 1 makes for a satisfying conclusion because in the mind's ear, the listener craves for a return to the beginning. Sir Donald Tovey points out that the coda was a late addition to the score. This lovely reappearance of the first theme was an afterthought added into the autograph on an extra leaf. Some concluding comments on the second movement. According to Elaine Sisman, this slow movement, along with those of Mozart's symphonies number 38, 39, and 40, all disrupt their lyrical flow with disturbing transitional passages of powerful emotional expressiveness. This is a feature not found in earlier Mozart symphonies. It is, however, to be found in the slow movements of his piano concertos of 1784 through 1786, numbers 14 through 25. Mozart designated this movement cantabile in the score. This is his only such designation for a slow movement. About Theme 1, Sisman notes that it is never allowed to end. In its first appearance, it is interrupted and made to yield to figurations. In the recap, there is a much bigger disruption in the form of a secondary development. Even in the coda, says Sisman, the first theme cannot shake off the interruption. I have already made some comments about Mozart's unconventional use of sonata form for his time. To summarize, these include the following: the high degree of expressiveness of the exposition bridge and its counterpart in development, with minor key music that does not belong in a major key movement. The non-verbatim return of Theme 1 and recap and its secondary development, and the abbreviated bridge in recap. Why a secondary development? Why not place a Theme 1 development in the development section? It appears that Mozart wished to have the deep pathos of the C minor, D minor music to stand out on its own as a distinct expressive element of the movement. Mozart demonstrates in this movement that he is holding musical form, i.e., rules about the architecture of music, secondary to his expressive needs. This is the essence of the Romantic era aesthetic that was to be introduced by Beethoven in the upcoming 19th century. Mozart's music looks forward to the future. One wonders what else he would have produced had he not died at such a young age and survived into the 1800s alongside Beethoven. Movement 3, Menuetto. Minuet. The overall phrase structure of the minuet adheres to the classical era tradition. AA, BA prime, BA prime. Phrase A. This begins as a quiet melody and antecedent stated twice. The melody is in the first violins with a seesawing accompaniment in second violins. Its tail end is highlighted by brass and timpani accents, giving it a somewhat regal feel. The consequent is louder in the whole orchestra. It comes to a convincing conclusion. Here is Minuet, phrase A. Note that most of Mozart's minuets start forte, loud. This one starts piano, soft. Phrase B. This is louder, longer, and more elaborate. It is motivically closely related to phrase A. It begins with an extension of the quiet melody of phrase A in winds and strings. The music then gets louder and more ceremonial with dotted rhythms, and with a passage that develops the main motive of phrase A. Here is phrase B. Phrase A prime. This features the quiet antecedent melody of phrase A in variation. It is an oboe with a counter melody in bassoon. The louder consequent is repeated verbatim. Now, let's listen to the entire minuet. I will narrate the different phrases. Phrase A. Phrase A. Phrase B. Phrase A prime. Phrase B. Phrase A prime. Trio. Trio sections in minuet and trio movements provide contrasting music to the minuet. They tend to be lowly instrumented, but not strictly three instruments, as the name implies. The overall phrase structure of this trio is once again AA, BA prime, BA prime. Phrase A. This is a quiet, thin-textured, four-square melody. It begins with a two-note rising antecedent in flute with a long, short rhythm. A dance-like consequent follows in oboe and violins. It is a playful, falling melody. The antecedent consequent is repeated, the latter providing a conclusion. A brief turn of phrase provides transition. Note, the two-note antecedent is actually an inversion of the cadential gesture of the minuet that preceded it. The fact that Mozart begins his trio with an ending has attracted some scholarly attention. Phrase B. This is a loud, agitated A minor passage in full orchestra in which the two-note figure of phrase A is extended and developed. Strings provide an pa accompaniment. This sudden eruption of angst parallels similar ones in the first and second movements. A brief, more peaceful passage with the two-note figure in violins provides transition. Here's the trio, phrase B. Note that phrase B foreshadows the four-note main theme of the fourth movement. Phrase A prime. This is a slight variation of phrase A. The melody is the same, the ending is louder, scored for more wind instruments. Let's now listen to the entire trio. I will narrate the phrases. Phrase A. Phrase A. Phrase B, A minor. Calm tail. Phrase A prime. Phrase B. Phrase A prime. Michael Steinberg says, the trio is, for the most part, an enchanting dialogue of ever so slightly coquettish strings and winds. Minuet da capo. The word da capo means back to the head, back to the beginning. In keeping with classical tradition, the da capo is abbreviated. The various phrases remain identical to those of the first minuet. The phrase structure is A, B, A prime. Comments on the minuet and trio. Despite the forward-looking features of movements 1 and 2, and a yet-to-be-discussed, even more innovative movement 4, Mozart delivers a conventional third movement that adheres to the classical tradition in every way. Perhaps the only slight variation is the angst of the B phrase of the trio. Within 15 years, Beethoven would begin making mincemeat out of the minuet and trio, beginning with the Symphony No. 2 of 1803, where for the first time he called his third movement a scherzo. The word means joke in Italian. The scherzo was Beethoven's joke on the minuet, and it took hold for the rest of the 19th century. Mozart does not seem to have anticipated this development. Once again, I wonder what Mozart would have thought of Beethoven's scherzo had he survived into the 19th century. My bet is he would have loved it and embraced the idea wholeheartedly. Movement 4, Molto Allegro. Richard Atkinson, another musical aficionado physician who has a wonderful analysis of this seminal movement in YouTube, says, quote, "The movement has been celebrated in more than 200 years as one of the quintessential examples of craftsmanship in Western music." Unquote. In this movement, Mozart delivers yet another sonata form structure, but the music features the complex polyphony of an era bygone to Mozart. I will point out the sonata structure as I always do. However, the intricacies of the polyphony cannot be fully appreciated without an analysis of the score itself. I will do my best to point whatever is audible. The polyphony is built on 5 basic motives which will be described in order of their appearance. Exposition. The first 3 of the 5 main motives are presented at the outset in Theme 1. These are as follows. Motive A is a 4-note rising idea presented initially in first violins. Note that motive A is a common melody that goes back to Gregorian chant and has been ubiquitously used from Palestrina to Brahms. Mozart had used this melody in his very first symphony of 1764. Motive B is an antecedent consequent phrase. The antecedent is a 4-note idea with a rhythmic profile of short, 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 long. Ta-ta-ta-ta. It is remarkably similar to Beethoven's famous Fate motive from his 5th Symphony. Ta-ta-ta-ta. The consequent is a fast figuration. Here's motive B, antecedent and consequent. Motive C is a fanfare that ends the theme. It is a martial dotted figure in winds and brass, followed by a descending configuration of 8th notes and strings. It appears in canon when first presented. Canon means in overlapping entries like row, row, row your boat. Here is motive C. Note that this motive C will be a recurring feature in the movement. It is the easiest to hear, even in some complex polyphonic passages. It often functions as a cadential figure. Cadential means ending or closing figure. Theme 1 in C major is a lively piece of music that features these 3 motives. It is presented twice, the first time homophonic, the second time polyphonic as a fugue. In the first presentation of Theme 1, motives A and B appear quietly in first violins with a 2-note ostinato in second violins. Again, an ostinato is a recurring musical figure, usually in the bass. Motives A and B are then repeated forte in orchestra. Motive C appears as a cadential figure, first in wind and brass, and then extended in full orchestra. Here is Theme 1, the first homophonic presentation. Motive A. Motive B. Louder, motive A. Motive B. Motive C. In the second fugato presentation of Theme 1, fugato means mini fugue, motive A returns as a quiet 3-part fugue in strings. The imitative entries of the fugue progress from high to low strings. Here is Theme 1, second presentation, fugato. Next is the modulating bridge. It is a loud polyphonic passage in the whole orchestra. The bridge features the 4th main motive, motive D. This bridge motive consists of 3 rising staccato notes followed by a trilled dotted figure. Ta-ta-ta-ta-da-da. The modulating bridge passage begins with motive A, then motive D in strings is added in counterpoint. Motive C provides a cadential gesture, the fanfare in stretto. Here is the modulating bridge. Motive A, motive D, motive C in stretto. Let's take a minute and discuss the term stretto. Stretto is a term used for fugues. It is a succession of overlapping statements of the fugue subject, especially towards the final section. Note that even though the term stretto strictly applies to Baroque-era fugues, it is often used by scholars in reference to fugato passages in classical and Romantic-era music. Here, the term applies to motives repeated in close succession, overlapping with each other. Stretto is one of those musical events better appreciated in the score than by ear. Nevertheless, I will continue mentioning prominent strettos when they occur. Theme 2 appears in the expected key of G major, the dominant of C major. The main element of this theme is a new three-note motive E. This is the last of our 5 main motives. Da-da-da. Motive E is initially quiet in strings. It is accompanied by echoes of motive C in flute. This is a polyphonic passage, motive C in counterpoint. The theme continues quietly with a stretto on motive D. Then, a sudden rise in volume. A loud 4-part stretto on motive E. This music has great momentum and does not break. It continues on into the closing section. Here is theme 2. Motive E. Motive C in counterpoint. Motive D. Loud stretto on motive E. Closing section in G major. Without losing any momentum, the music continues loud and energetic with polyphonic passages, initially based on motive B, then motive C. This includes both the original motive C and its inversion. An inversion is the reverse of the original melody. The exposition ends with a Mannheim cadence. The music suddenly and dramatically quiets down on 2 statements of motive C, first in oboe, then bassoon. I will explain the Mannheim cadence after we hear some music. Let's now hear the closing section. Motive B, polyphonic. Motive C, polyphonic. Mannheim cadence. Now we are ready to hear the full exposition. Theme 1. Theme 1 Fugato version. Modulating bridge. Motive D. Theme 2, motive E. Theme 2, loud stretto on motive E. Closing section, motive B. Closing section, motive C. Mannheim cadence. An aside on the Mannheim School. This refers to an outstanding orchestra that existed in Mannheim, its accomplishments peaking in the second half of the 1700s. It was influential in the evolution of classical-era music. The father of the Mannheim School was Johann Stamitz, 1717 to 1757. He is, by the way, credited for creating the four-movement symphony, adding the minuet and trio to the previously three-movement model. Among the many innovations of the Mannheim Orchestra were the following: the Mannheim Rocket, a swiftly ascending passage, usually a rising arpeggiated line in crescendo. The Mannheim Roller, extended crescendo, usually a rising melody over an ostinato bass. The Mannheim Sigh, a gesture that placed more weight on the first two notes of descending pairs. Mannheim Birds, imitation of birds chirping in solo passages. The Grand Pause, momentary pause where the orchestra briefly stops, total silence, before resuming vigorously. And finally, the Mannheim Cadence, a high-energy section of music that dramatically drops down to quiet at the end. It was often preceded by a Mannheim Rocket. Mozart visited Mannheim from 1777 onwards and was much impressed by the orchestra. Also remember that he married a woman from Mannheim. Onward to development. The development is in four parts. In part 1, motive A is contrasted with motive C, the cadential fanfare. The music is quiet. It begins with a G major passage in which motive A in strings is answered by motive C in oboe and bassoons. The music then modulates to E major, and in a second passage, motive A in strings is answered by an inversion of motive C in flute and bassoons. Once again, an inversion is a melody in which the original is played with the notes in reverse. Here is part 1. Part 2 is a loud polyphonic passage based on motive C. It consists of a four-part stretto on various fragments of motive C taken through different key areas in a loud tutti passage. The passage utilizes both motive C and its inversion. In part 3, motive A is again contrasted with motive C. Motive A, quiet in oboe and bassoon, receives a vigorous motive C response in strings. This response is polyphonic. It is a stretto on motive C and its inversion. This sequence is then repeated in developmental variations. Part 4 provides a transition into recapitulation. It is an assertive polyphonic passage based on motive C and its inversion. A quiet transition to C major then occurs in preparation for recap. It features fragments of motive C in bassoon and horn, followed by the full motive C in strings. Richard Atkinson calls this a wonderfully elegant modulation to C major. Here's development part 4 and into recap. Polyphonic passage based on motive C. quiet transition to C major. Recap. Now let's put it all together and hear the entire development. Part 1. Part 2. Part 3. Part 4. Quiet transition. Recap. Recapitulation. In recapitulation, material presented in the exposition returns, but not all verbatim. Mozart makes some alterations, most notably to Theme 1. Recap begins quietly with Theme 1, motives A and B stated in strings. This is an extremely truncated version of the theme compared to the exposition. It is followed by a loud, dissonant developmental passage based on motive A. The passage begins with motive A in first violins, stated in C, D, and E major. It continues with motive A in stretto for the first time in D and then C major. Let's hear the recap of Theme 1. Note that this mostly developmental treatment of an otherwise extremely truncated Theme 1 is not typical of classical era recaps. The passage leaves the listener with a false impression that maybe the music is still in development. In this regard, the recap parallels that of the second movement. Without a break in the momentum, the music continues into the bridge. This passage returns as in the exposition with motive D and a stretto on motive C. Theme 2 follows, now in the home key of C major as expected. It is only slightly altered from the exposition. The closing section continues the momentum, as happened in the exposition, with motive B, but in different key areas than in the exposition. It ends with a stretto on motive C. The quiet Mannheim cadence is varied. Bassoon plays an inversion of motive C, flute plays the actual motive C. Here's the remainder of the recap from bridge through the closing section. Bridge. Theme 2. Closing section. cadence. Coda. The coda brings together the polyphonic features of the movement in one final, skillful display before a grand conclusion. It is in 4 parts. In part 1, the coda opens with a loud, tutti statement of motive C that ends in an open cadence. Note that coming on the heels of the 2 quieter motive Cs of the preceding Mannheim cadence, this sounds as though it belongs with the end of recap. But in the score, it is clearly marked as the beginning of the coda. Mozart's expressive purpose with this small gesture is simply to continue the fast momentum of the music. In part 2, the coda continues quietly in strings with a stretto on an inverted motive A. Part 3 is the heart of the coda. It is a fugue that incorporates all the main motives of the movement. It begins with motive A that starts in wince, motive E in strings enters in canon. The fugue subsequently incorporates motives C and D. The passage continues with these motives in polyphony, interchangeably appearing in different instrument groups. Richard Atkinson calls this section the crowning moment of the symphony, an incredibly complex passage that features 5-part invertible counterpoint. Finally, in part 4, the coda ends with loud homophonic statements of motive B followed by motive C. Loud concluding chords mark a triumphant finish. Here's the coda. Motive C, part 1. Part 2, motive A. Part 3, heart of the coda, the complex passage. Motive C. A few comments on the 4th movement. I omitted a 5th motive in the movement from my description that participates in the final polyphony. This initially appears as part of the theme 2 complex. It is a subtle motive that is hard to hear. For those interested in following the complex polyphony of Movement 4 with a color-coded score running along with the music, I highly recommend Richard Atkinson's analysis on YouTube. You can find the web address of Atkinson's presentation in the lecture notes that accompany this talk on my website. About the 4th movement, Elaine Sisman says, "Even had Mozart known in advance that this would be the last movement of his last symphony, he could not have surpassed the Jupiter finale." Some scholars have characterized this movement as a synthesis of sonata form and fugue. Michael Steinberg. Mozart whirls the motives of the final movement by us with a fierce energy that is rooted in his dazzling polyphony. Especially during development, the expressive intensity generated by that energy is exhilarating, shocking, and uplifting all at once. I would now like to take an aside to discuss 2 main styles of the classical and Baroque eras respectively and their relationship to Mozart's Jupiter Symphony. The galant style versus the learned style. In the mid-1700s, a style called galant had superseded Baroque music. This was part of a general galant movement in art. The word is French. It means elegant. Mozart is considered one of the major practitioners of the galant style in music. His Eine kleine Nachtmusik is a good example of this style. Major hallmarks of the galant style are as follows. a return to simplicity and immediacy in music, as opposed to the complexity of the Baroque. In other words, easy listening. Galant style music is melody-driven with simpler, song-like melodies. In keeping with its easy listening goal, galant music features a dramatic reduction in polyphony. Multiple musical lines of equal importance, polyphony, gives way to one main musical line with all others in support, homophony, something that is much easier in our ears. There is thus a clear distinction between the soloist and the accompaniment. Along with this, the harmonic language of music is simplified, emphasizing the tonic and dominant. This is a fundamental feature of sonata form, a musical structure that matured in the era of galant music. The complex Baroque music practiced by the likes of Johann Sebastian Bach is called the learned or strict style. It is exemplified by the fugue. It features complex polyphony and harmonic rhythm and thick textures, multiple simultaneous lines of music. Over the ensuing centuries, scholars have come down on the side of one or other of these two styles. Speaking against Baroque music and the learned style, Enlightenment-era philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau expressed a sentiment that many of us listeners feel. Fugues are unintelligible because several voices speaking at once are unintelligible. Taking a counter-argument, German musicologist and music theorist Johann Niklaus Forkel said, "Fugues are powerful because they can represent and thus move the emotions of many people at once, adding voices one by one, just as in nature." In the final movement of the Jupiter, his last symphony, Mozart, a famed practitioner of the galant style, returned to the old-fashioned, complex, hard-to-listen-to, learned style. He did it with impressive skill and much grace. The result was unanimous praise from scholars and critics. Final comments. In the last symphony, we reach what is really the final subtlety of an immensely experienced artist, says Sir Donald Tovey. And back to my quote at the beginning. It is perhaps insufficiently recognized how revolutionary the Jupiter Symphony is in its ideas and their working out. Neil Zaslow. We will have Mozart himself say the final words. Mozart remains unique as a crowd pleaser even when he writes complex polyphonic music, as in the fourth movement of the Jupiter. Scholars and cognoscenti sometimes snub their noses at crowd pleasers. Felix Mendelssohn, for example, is on the receiving end of such scholarly scorn. Mozart is not. He somehow manages to please the crowds and the cognoscenti. Mozart was well aware of this issue. A famous comment he made in 1782 about his piano concerti applies to his other music as well. His music, said Mozart, strikes a mean between too difficult and too easy. Here and there, connoisseurs alone can derive satisfaction. The non-connoisseurs cannot fail to be pleased, although without knowing why. Thank you for your attention, and farewell.